Listen up, get ready, I'm not gonna take no more. There's a revolution, a revelation going on in my soul. Buckle up, get ready, we're not gonna sit back. Okay, now we're about to have our first segment and our first guest of the day, the one and only Alan Mills from the Uptown People's Law Center. He's no stranger to this show. In the past, he's come on, he's talked a lot about prisons, and I think we're going to talk about that a bit today. Good morning or afternoon, depending on where and what time it is. How are you, Alan?
I'm doing great.
So
it's always a pleasure to come back to the show.
You're always welcome. And if you have something you want to get on in a hurry, just tell me. I'm ready. The more help I get, the better. Prisons is something that's not in the not talked about as much as we would like it to be talked about, and the attention paid to it is not as much as it deserves. How about you filling us a little bit in on what's going on in the Illinois prison system and some of the work that you and the people at Uptown People's Law Center are doing?
So we're doing a whole bunch of stuff on prisons. The Uptown People's Law Center has been dealing with prisoners since its founding in the mid-1970s. The people who founded the Uptown People's Law Center before my time very much believed that when people from the community went into the jail or went into the prison, they were still their neighbors, they're still part of the family, and therefore were still part of our community that we represented. So since that time, we have represented prisoners. It has expanded, so it's now about half of what we do is represent prisoners, and representing prisoners has now begun to bleed over into some of our other work, like housing and Social Security. The first thing I want to talk about today is, in fact, how it's bled over to some of the housing work we did. So Cook County, actually led by our current mayor, but back when he was the commissioner, passed what's called the Just Housing Amendment, which generally, and I can get into details in a minute, generally prohibits housing discrimination against people with a criminal record. So that was driven by the fact that people come out of prison, and one of the things they absolutely need is a place to live. If you haven't got a place to live, then you're likely to go back again because you're on the streets. So now it's generally not legal to discriminate against people because they have a criminal record in Cook County.
And is everyone who goes to Cook County it has a record? Is everyone protected? Any kind of record?
Not quite. So the law has sort of two exemptions. One, it has totally exempted sex offenders for no particularly good reason based on the data. But in order to get it passed, that's the only thing I had to do. And politics is all about the art of compromise. So they had to exclude all sex offenders from the coverage. So if you have a sex offense, this law is not going to help you at all. The second thing is recent criminal convictions. So any criminal conviction or even arrest or anything else more than 3 years old, they can't look at it at all, period. Doesn't matter what it was for. Doesn't matter if you committed murder. If you committed murder 30 years ago and you got out of prison yesterday, they can't even look at the fact you committed murder. Anything within the last,
they'd be able to get housing.
They'd be able to get housing, right? They're completely covered by this law. You can't discriminate against them. Anything within the arrests within the last 3 years, anything that wasn't conviction, they also can't look at it at all. Actual convictions in the last year, within the last 3 years, they can look at, but they have to be able to show, landlords that is, have to be able to show that excluding you would have some direct connection to the safety of the building, the health of the other residents, et cetera. So it can't just be a blanket saying we don't rent to anybody with criminal records within the last 3 years. They have to make an individualized determination of whether or not you, with a particular crime you committed, would jeopardize the safety of the building.
So this law is already in effect?
Yes.
And how many people have benefited from the law?
Well, we don't really know that. We at the Uptown People's Law Center are one of the two organizations that are sort of formally enforcing this, or taking the lead in enforcing it. Between the two of us, I think we have succeeded in about 25 cases. However, most of those weren't formally filed. Most of them are resolved informally before you have to file an actual complaint. And part of the reason, and there's no way therefore to track those. So I don't know how many people have benefited from the law. I don't know how many landlords are complying voluntarily with the law. We are concerned that not enough cases are getting filed, and that's one of the reasons I want to talk about it on the show today, is make sure more people know about this case or more about this law, because most people, either landlords or tenants, don't know it exists out there. But you asked the question of how do we prove it, and actually the law is really well written in order to help that. Landlords can't even ask about a criminal background until after they've decided you are otherwise eligible for the apartment. So if they ask about it, then that means they've already decided you can rent it. So therefore, if they then turn you down, it has to be because of your background. There's no other reason. So they can't, if they ask on the like application form, if they have a checkbox, have you ever been committed of a crime, that is a violation of the ordinance. If they run a background check before they have decided you're eligible for the apartment, that's a violation of the ordinance. So all these things make it much easier to enforce the Just Housing Amendment than it would be in normal discrimination cases where you have to prove that that was the motivating factor.
Alan Mills, let me ask you, who were the sponsors in the House and the Senate of this bill?
It's not the House and Senate. This is the Cook County Commissioners. It only applies in Cook County.
This is unfortunately. I apologize. I should have done my research a little more. So this is just Cook County. It's not the state of Illinois.
Right. I mean, you can get out of prison anywhere, but it only applies to housing in Cook County. So it was done by the Cook County Commissioners. It was Commissioner Brandon Johnson, who is now obviously our mayor, who was the main sponsor in the county board, and then the Sergeant Shriver Center and several other groups are the ones that really pushed it through and got it passed.
Let me ask you, have you had any really great successes in this that you want to share with the masses or tuned in or watching? Yeah, I mean, part of the issue is what counts as housing. So there are a number of things that are called SMRFs, SMRHFs, they're not little blue people. These are specialized mental health treatment facilities or something like that. I can never remember what the acronym stands for. But basically, there are places where people can have residential care. They live there and they get their mental health care in these facilities. So we had a person who was stuck in prison because he hadn't got anywhere to go because he needed some specialized mental health care to get out. So he was stuck in prison. We found one of these organizations that he could go to and had a vacant spot. And then they turned him down because of his criminal record. So he sued them, and their defense was, well, we're actually a treatment facility. We're not a residential facility, and therefore we're not covered. The county board ruled otherwise. They ruled that because people live there, it counted as a residence. So first of all, that has benefited a lot of people who would be otherwise stuck in prison because they haven't got a mental health facility to go to. And hopefully it would expand it to other places, like, for example, nursing homes should not be able to discriminate against people with criminal records, which historically they have done. And it means that there are a whole lot of people stuck in prison who really have physical or mental disabilities so that they can't just go out and get their own apartment. They need some sort of specialized care. And those have been people who have been historically very hard to find housing for. So many of those people are stuck in prison just because of their disability. So hopefully this success will open up the doors so more people can go home when their sentences are over. I'm going to throw in this. Are there any people who have gotten housing and then have lost it again because of more criminal activity?
Not that we're aware of. I'm sure it's going to happen. And I'm sure when it does happen, some people will jump up and down and say this is a terrible law. But people have to remember that, no matter what we do at this point, 50% of the people who come out have a new involvement with criminal law. So, the fact that one or two people may, under this particular ordinance, shouldn't in any way mean that the ordinance is a bad idea. It's definitely, in my opinion and those of other experts, will cut down on the number of people who go back to prison.
Let's hope so. Have you? What are the hurdles in enforcing this law that you find that you have to confront?
I think the biggest hurdle is people don't know about it. Last year, there were only 12 cases filed before the commission, the Human Rights Commission, that enforces this, and I can't believe that's because every landlord in the city is complying with it. I think it's because tenants don't know their rights, and therefore they are not complaining when they get turned down. Anybody who has such a complaint should contact us at the Uptown People's Law Center, UPLC at uplcchicago.org, and we'll be happy to look into it. And if there is in fact a violation, take up your case.
Well, in closing on this part of our discussion, why is this a good law?
It's a good law because it helps people stay out of prison and get out of prison. Prison is not good for anybody. And certainly once you have served your time, once you've paid your penalty, it shouldn't be a lifetime disability. There's no reason in the world why people who get out of prison should be forced to be homeless.
And that is unfortunately happens way too often. If you look at the homeless encampments all over the city, and they're growing, you'll see a remarkable number of people that have spent some time in prison or otherwise or Cook County Jail.
Well, let's. This is good. So this is the Just Housing Amendment, and it's in Cook County the board got it through, and it's going on, and a number of people have benefited, and we'll see. It sounds like a really good thing to me. Let's switch a little bit. You're up in the prisons. You do a lot of work with prisoners and issues around prisoners' rights, et cetera. What do you got going on? You have a new case going on that has to do with something like out of our negative historical past with poll taxes and literacy tests and that kind of thing. What's that?
I mean, so I think anybody who looks at the prison system or our criminal justice system broadly is aware that it's an extremely racially biased system. There's no question that there's an overrepresentation of Black people and overrepresentation of all people of color in our criminal justice system in general. Anybody who walks through Cook County Jail will immediately see that the vast majority of folks in there are Black, and very few white people are in that prison or in that jail. Same is true of the prison. So the lawsuit we just filed has a tiny little piece of that. Several years ago, the Illinois legislature passed a law saying that everybody who's getting out within the next 6 months out of prison should have the opportunity to take a civics class. And they said that the most effective way to actually teach those civics classes was for other prisoners to teach them. Each one teach one, an old thing from the 60s, right? So that's applied here in the prison. So there was a man who Centralia Prison in downstate Illinois was teaching one of those classes. And he got to the point where they were talking about the pre-civil rights era, so the 40s, 50s, and 60s in the South, and how they used various methods to try to suppress the Black vote. He was talking about the literacy tests and the poll taxes. As he was having this discussion during his class, the prison official who was in charge of sort of monitoring the class, he wasn't teaching it, but he's supposed to be there, interrupted and said, "You're lying to them." He said the literacy tests had nothing to do with trying to suppress the Black vote, that they were completely race neutral. And the only reason we had them was to ensure that people knew what they were voting for. So my prisoner, Mr. McNeil, said, "No, that is not true. These are clearly racist." And then the guard again interrupted and said, no, they're not racist. And you're talking about racism in this class is divisive. You shouldn't be talking about racism. You should be just talking about voting and voting rights without any racial background. So he insisted on talking about it. He got a disciplinary report. He was barred from teaching the class anymore. And the prisoner has since then, and it's now been over a year, not been allowed to have any other job at Centralia. So he just sits in his cell all day long. So he's essentially been blackballed because he refused to lie about literacy tests being racist.
Wow. So how come prisoners are teaching other prisoners in the first place? Is this something that goes on in our prisons?
Almost never. I mean, it happened. This was unique, and it was pushed by a lot of folks who thought that people getting out of prison weren't even aware that they were allowed to vote, because in many states, of course, they aren't. And that's made a lot of press nationally. So a lot of people get out of prison thinking they're not allowed to vote, or they don't know who to vote for, or they don't think voting matters. So the legislature thought it'd be a good idea that people getting out of prison should be educated as to what their voting rights are, as to what the history of voting is, the struggle for voting rights, to understand that this was not just a gift that was given to people, that people actually went out there and fought, and in some cases died in order to ensure that everybody had a right to vote. And they thought the most effective way to get that message across was to have other prisoners, each one teach one, rather than having a bunch of guards try to impart that knowledge to prisoners, which would never really work.
It's really surprising that this, you would think that people knew the history of voting rights in this country and the civil rights movement. This is, wow, it's blowing me away. Was this a rogue officer? Tell us about the officer that did this.
I mean, I wish I would say it was a rogue. But we tried to resolve this informally. We contacted the chief legal counsel of the Illinois Department of Corrections, who didn't take any action. My client filed a formal grievance, which went all the way up the chain of command to the director's office, and they refused to do anything about it. So This has been endorsed by the highest levels in the Department of Corrections. Now, I'm not sure anybody actually believes this. The head of the Department of Corrections right now is a Black woman. So I find it hard to believe that she actually believes this. But, I think that what's really happening here is it's very much embedded in the racism that underlies the entire system. And unfortunately, we have candidates running for office. I mean, this happened well before, but we filed the lawsuit shortly after. Nikki Haley gave this response to the New Hampshire presidential primary, where she was asked the cause of the Civil War and refused to say anything about slavery. And then you have people like Ted Cruz in Texas talking about how slavery was actually good for people. And Ron DeSantis saying that slavery meant that people got training and skills they wouldn't otherwise have. So you have a section of this country now who is trying to rewrite that history and trying to erase the entire struggle for civil rights as if it didn't happen. And I think, this is deep Southern Illinois. The prison official who was involved was white. It's the heart of Trump country. I mean, people think about Illinois as being a blue state, but if you look at the map, in terms of acreage, there's a bright red sea south of Chicago. And Centralia Prison, where this happened, is in the middle of that bright red sea.
Was this a prison official or this guard who was monitoring the class? Is he in a union? And
he is. AFSCME is the union that represents all prison employees. So he is absolutely part of AFSCME.
It's sort of always a contradiction that you have, there are certain unions, and we root for unions, but there are a few of them that really are usually on the wrong side and protect them from while they do the wrong thing.
I mean, AFSCME is not usually on the wrong side.
No.
AFSCME, the real irony here is AFSCME was the one that was doing the garbage strike when Martin Luther King went down to support and was assassinated. That was AFSCME that organized that strike. And here they are denying the fact that the Voting Rights Act needed to be passed for anything. It's just the most ironic thing in history.
Well, what are your next steps? What are you going to do about this?
Well, we just filed a lawsuit. It's a brand new lawsuit, so we don't have a date or anything. It was assigned to a judge in the Southern District. The next thing that will happen is the defendants will be served, and it'll be interesting to see whether or not they are willing to stand up and actually say in court what they said in the classroom, which is that literacy tests were in fact race neutral. I would be very surprised if they take that position in court, but we shall see.
What would you like people to do who may be listening and wanted to, take a little bit of a stand or to help you all take a stand on this issue?
Well, the first thing I would, just for people's curiosity, we dug out a copy of the actual literacy test that they used in Louisiana, attached it to our complaint, and it's now or will be within the next hour or so on our website. So take the test. I took it and I could not pass. I suspect that you would have a hard time passing it as well. It's a 10-minute test, 10-minute time limit. And if you get one question wrong, you fail. You can't vote. I failed. I couldn't finish it in 10 minutes, let alone get them all right. And they weren't questions, and they had nothing to do with literacy whatsoever. It's like draw a line going, 2 over the next dots and 2 under the next dots, and 1 above that. It's understanding complex directions. But more generally, what can you do to support us? The Uptown People's Law Center is always looking for donations. We are a donation-driven place. We are not-for-profit. Our website has a button, so you can go to our website either to learn more about either of these things I just talked about. Lots of resources on our website, and each of our pages has a donate button. So check out what we're doing, click that donate button, and help us keep doing it.
Well, Alan Mills, this is good. It's always good talking to you. I know that we put on here to maybe talk about the White Sox and a little bit of racist history about financing a stadium. And now there's a call for new stadiums and stuff. So we're going to have you back. And of course, we'll have you back anytime you want to share some information on these cases that you brought up today. The one about prisoners in a class and talking about literacy tests and racism, and the other about people being able to get housing when they come out of prison.
Happy to do that. And I definitely should come back and talk about the White Sox shortly. So we'll figure out a date to do that.
In the sports section, there's a guy named Sean Densis who was on this show years ago, and he did a book about the United Center and how that got built and all the promises they made to the community that really haven't happened. Okay. Yep.